All right, welcome to round 2 of episode 2 of Simply Stated with Aaron and Andrew. All that rhymed. So we've already been talking for a while. You may have
Apparently it's all gone, but
well, the video is. We still got audio, but whatever. So essentially, we're getting into chapter 9 of the book Behave, which focuses almost entirely on the interplay between culture and the individual, on how brains influence culture and how cultures influence brains. We're essentially looking at the ecological phenomenon of the co-evolution of human society. That was not simply stated. So let's state that pretty simply. We're looking at how I influence all that and how all that influences me.
exactly.
And how essentially genetics and culture cannot be separated. As much as people would like to simplify things and oversimplify things, they're one and the same in terms of how they are evolving. So
Can you give me an example?
perfect example. So there are two really different types of cultures that people like to look at: collectivist and individualistic. So collectivists really focus on let me look at my notes, on harmony, interdependence, conformity, and the needs of the group guiding behavior, whereas individualistic cultures focus on autonomy, personal achievement, uniqueness. We're essentially looking at the West versus the East, America versus China.
Exactly.
And when we look at different societies and the genetics of people within those societies, certain differences pop out. So there is a specific type of dopamine receptor that is responsible for novelty seeking. So it's
The R7?
yeah, I'm getting there. So there's a receptor called the DRD4. So it's the dopamine receptor for whatever D4 version of dopamine is. And there's a specific variation that has 7 repeating cycles of this part of dopamine. And in Asia and Asiatic cultures, places that were well established and haven't been migrated into for a long time, the prevalence of this 7R version of dopamine is in less than 1% of people in East Asia. So less than 1% of people over there are seeking novel experiences based on genetics. Now, if you look at Euro-Americans, the same receptor, there's more than 23% of Americans have that same receptor. And there were studies that looked at the globe in terms of when they were migrated to. And essentially, as you traveled from Africa up towards Asia and Europe, the instances of 7R increased a little bit. And then as you continue traveling west, they increase a little bit more. Same with east up into Alaska from Asia. There was suddenly more 7R in the peoples and the native peoples there. And then down America, there's even more, all the way to the tip of South America. So at the tip of South America, the most 7R versions of this dopamine receptor were prevalent, which means they were the most novel-seeking people. Now, it can be easy for somebody to say, oh, the 7R dictated whether people migrated or not, but it could easily be specific cultures shifted against this novelty-seeking behavior and booted those people out. And so,
Right. And also, it didn't happen instantly. It happened over time. So as these cultures got more and more defined and more set and more established, it selected against that 7R variant, at least in Eastern cultures, more and more and more. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about co-evolved. It didn't happen overnight. And as one thing happened, it led to another thing genetically. And then as those genetics now propagate more and more, now the new people coming into that culture are even more set in a collectivistic manner, right? Or if you're in the United States, a more of a individualistic manner. And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about co-evolved. You can't have one without the other.
mm-hmm.
Totally.
Yeah. So I feel like that dopamine receptor highlights it really well, but also a quick look at how the ecosystem influences culture, influences genetics. So really briefly, we can just look at how in Asia, their primary source for sustenance in terms of a plant was rice. Totally. And rice required completely changing the landscape of hillsides and making it so that they could actually farm rice. It also required everyone to essentially work together to get a viable harvest. So
Collectivistic
people
farming.
had
Right.
to become collectivistic farmers, and they had to start thinking about the whole picture, sacrificing self-needs. People who wanted to pursue individualistic goals were essentially booted because they weren't going to help with the rice. So they had to leave. They were either forced to leave or wanted to leave during their teenage years when novelty seeking peaks.
Totally.
Whereas even in East Asian cultures that harvested wheat, so still right next to people who harvested rice, right next to collectivistic cultures, they became
when the landscape changed and you couldn't farm rice, and now we're in a whole new ecosystem. We have different needs, different physical needs. And what did that create? That created wheat farming. And wheat farming is a way more individualistic type of pursuit. And so within that culture, all of their cultural norms benefited to be more individualistic. And so they had less of that. I mean, they had more of that 7R variant, right? And that is within the same country, you know, separate
same race,
same type of people. And it, you know, it just goes to show you how we were really shaped by the needs to survive, at least at the beginning, right? And, you know, a little thing to think about, you know, we don't have to get too far into this, but as humans start to expand even outside of Earth, right? I think, like, you know, we're trying to get to Mars right now. And I'm thinking 500 years from now, right? And we have a culture set in Mars. We have an ability to shape the values of that culture, but at the same time, I bet we could predict how that culture will be based off of its resource scarcity. And they're going to be way more about the collectivistic, work together, scarce resources, science-minded, and, you know, what was that?
But at the same time, who's going to Mars? Or is it the collectivistic people who want to be part of the group, or is it the people who want to seek out on new adventure?
But once they're there, it doesn't matter. Because now once you have people born on Mars, they're not from Earth. They're not from our culture, America.
I see what you're saying. Once people are born on Mars.
It's Mars culture.
I guess the only issue is the people, as long as the people who don't go there first dictate the culture, because it makes me think of this study with chickens that Robert Sapolsky documents in the book Behave, that look at, they took the 5 best producing chickens from different herds. So these are the chickens that produce the most eggs. They brought them together into one coop to make like a super coop.
Yeah.
And then none of them produced anymore. Like they all stopped being superstar producing chickens, because what made them high producers was they were able to peck on lesser chickens in the pecking order. That's funny. That's where that came from. Right. I just realized that while I said it.
Nice.
But so then when they were all together, all the alphas were together, and now none of them were alphas. And so none of them were getting the beneficial hormonal response of beating up the lesser chickens. And so,
and they were all peckers. So they all pecked each other, and they worked against their goal, which is to produce more eggs, pass on more genes.
So part of me is wondering, okay, who's going to Mars? Is it these superstars? And what happens when they all come together under one vacuum sealed roof?
And this goes to show you the dangers of social engineering in general, right? And even looking here now, you know, we're able to, you know, put people's frozen sperm and eggs together and create babies. Wait till we create an artificial womb, right? And we're able to literally, you know, make people
grow babies.
Yeah.
Scary thought.
Yeah. And in that social engineering, idea, I can see a lot of positives from that. You take away the crack babies, right? You take away a lot of that, but at the same time, you don't get maybe the nutrients that you do in the womb that we talked about in previous chapters that are so important. You
don't get the variation that's outside of your control.
Exactly. And now by not having that variation, you know, going back to the collectivistic idea, are we going to be printing, you know, copies of the same type of person, right?
Yeah.
And but that's all for another talk. But the whole thing is, when you really look at social engineering and culture, it's so complicated, and there's so many little factors. But the reason why I asked about Mars was because that's like going back in time. That's going to a new place with scarce resources, and you have to start over. But here on Earth, we've advanced so far from the hunter-gatherer days and the days where you you couldn't eat if you didn't farm, right? Now we have grocery stores, we have all these things. Our physical need changes to where it doesn't matter where you live, you have access to almost everything. So does our culture, is it now more dominated by the social and emotional needs opposed to the physical needs, or that interplay? Do you think that can change or is changing?
The interplay between social and emotional needs and physical needs,
right? Like, I think, right. But as this globalist world global trade continues and continues, as we lift up third world countries to and whether that's right or wrong, we don't know when you talk about happiness. But as we start to do that, now we're not evolving and changing based off of our geographical location.
Yeah.
We're purely evolving based off of our emotional needs, right? That's, at least in the United States.
I mean, for me, it just brings up so many issues. One just being that cultures evolve in an ecosystem, but they can be exported outside of that ecosystem. So
Right.
You look at Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, all of these cultures evolved in a specific place, but have since been exported across the world. And so once we know that we can export culture, it becomes pertinent to decide what is the best culture.
Right.
And the issue that I'm obviously poking right at right now is, what's the best culture? Who's to determine that? How do people determine that? So many people right now are in this state of mind of being so afraid to offend people, so afraid to minimize people's belief systems, that they're not willing to acknowledge differences, deficiencies in cultures.
Right.
And so it's problematic when we don't have a way to judge a culture. What, problematic?
It's used a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's problematic.
Yeah.
When we don't have a way to judge a culture objectively or even sensibly,
Right.
In terms of better or worse, and what better or worse means ethically.
So, and I agree with that. And it is hard, at least in the United States. I think a way that we've done it is, we've created multiple party system where just going the liberal versus conservative, obviously we have more, but really those are the only two that matter right now. Mm-hmm. Each group is able to represent a whole set of values that people abide by in a culture, in a sense, a liberal culture versus a conservative culture. And the whole point of our system is to be able to have that interplay between each two. When the conservative culture gets out of hand and a little corrupt, it's the liberal culture that says, no, you can't do that, and brings it back to the people, or at least that's how it's supposed to be. And the interplay between the two allows us to go forward in time in a way that helps both sides. Now, it's not a perfect system, but when we're talking about a global culture, I think working with other countries in a way that's not me versus you is a good way to get started.
Just before we move forward, do you think this bipartisan politics is good?
I think we have some big problems right now.
Well, hold on though. What were you just saying though?
I'm saying the idea of it, and when working at its best, it for example, we had segregation in the 60s here, right? And our system allowed people to speak up against this, unjust policy. And then it changed. And now it's a new social norm that, of course, segregation is not okay, and it gave us a mechanism to change. And that's the whole point. We're not perfect. We just have to give ourselves the ability to become better and better and better.
So all of this sits outside of bipartisan politics. But what I would like to highlight, which I think I haven't really thought about before, is what you're talking about is the benefits of a culture that has fluidity in it. So
exactly.
It's the ability to be fluid within the culture. So a culture's acknowledgement and permission to change.
Just like our brains, when we're young, have the fluidity to change based off of its needs. It's in that same vein.
Okay, so we're not in a lab and looking at different experiments and determining what is a good or a bad culture. But I think just from this conversation alone, something struck one of my natural intuitions, saying that the ability to be fluid is important in a culture, not necessarily to be able to be like liquefaction for a foundation. Like when LA gets hit with an earthquake,
Right.
you know, all their foundations are built on sand, so buildings can crumble. So not
Yeah.
necessarily there. We need to have foundational pillars, much like the United States has, much like every country has in the form of their what is it called? Constitution. Thank you. But yeah, the willingness to change when society dictates that it needs to is huge. And like you said, our ability to get rid of segregation, Jim Crow laws, and allow women the right to vote. I can't believe that happened not that long ago. But
yeah, and this is taking it outside of politics and governance, and looking at religion. And I'm not trying to talk down or bad about any religion, but when you look at Christianity today, right? Like the Pope went out and said that we accept homosexuality within our religion now.
No way.
Yeah,
I didn't know about that.
Yeah, that happened a few years ago. And
why is it still banned in Christian schools in the United States?
Well, that's some old dogma right there. But then when you look at people, religions that follow the Quran, that is a locked book that can never be rewritten, that can never change, and is confined to the words in it. And so it can't evolve. And that's the whole point. A lot of these cultures and systems were set up as mechanisms to help us succeed in that time period. And the reason cultures change is just like why we evolve. We evolve for new needs, for new priorities. And that's what we have to do, is we have to allow ourselves the ability to be fluid and change in the ways that we need to.
I think we're at this weird crux in our history, in that we don't have the same physical or ecological demands that are molding our culture.
Exactly.
At least we don't have these demands that are in our face. They're looming in the distance. We have limited resources coming up soon. We have limited clean water coming up. We have all these other issues that are going to be expanding as population size expands, but none of them are in our face. And so right now we feel like it's like when you go to a blank page to write something and it's like, I don't know what to write, but
Right.
if you have a prompt, suddenly it's so much easier to come up with something to write. Our culture doesn't have a prompt.
Exactly.
That's coming from the outside world. So we're trying to come up with it internally.
Now that I think about it, when I look at global warming, I guess that is a physical need. And so, but the thing about it, that it's not subject to any one area. It's everywhere. It's everyone. And, there's an example, I believe every 4 degrees, the temperature increases. There's like a 10% rise in violence. I had to find the quote. It's maybe not those numbers.
I think that was pretty on point.
Yeah, but the fact is just by pure temperature change within a given year creates more violence.
That's within a given day. That was a 4 degree increase in a day. That day in that city, violent crimes increased by 10%.
Yeah. So, but it's a double-edged sword, because wow, it's a big problem. It's a big thing. But guess what? It forces us to think as a global culture, and you have to in that manner, And so it's a double-edged sword, but I guess we aren't growing out of our physical necessity of evolution,
And global warming is so nondescript to so many. I mean, even it doesn't pop into my head every day.
Right.
It's not in your face. And humans respond so much better to a personal narrative than to some nondescript law or nondescript event.
Right.
And so it's hard to convince people that this is like, oh, this is why we need to globalize, and this is why we need to start pushing past our nation's borders, and kind of integrating mentally with the people around us.
Yeah. And it's so in our face right now with all these fires. We have like 3 months of big fire season, 4 months total, and we've already burned 2 million acres. We've burned the most land in history of California, and we still have 4 months to go, and a bunch of stuff's on fire right now.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, the window. It's dark outside. It's 4. It's not even 4 yet. It's not even 4, and it is pitch black outside because of smoke and clouds. It doesn't like I'm literally flabbergasted. I can't see the hill. This is insane.
And just imagine all the air we're breathing in, and how all those factors, which clearly state in here, lead to, less IQ and all the, I mean, obviously it's not as hyperbolic as that, but there's a cascade effect with everything, you know? And so, I mean, it's a hard thing to have to deal with, but it's a good thing to jump on for everyone to jump on. It's a story, it's a narrative that we can all get behind and say, hey, this is something we need to focus on, you know? And so at least with that, we have a little silver lining at the end, you know?
But all of this is making me just really open my eyes to the importance of culture in shaping humanity, and how if we're to have an impact at all as our generation, it needs to be on our culture, like directly. So we can affect intelligence, we can do research, we can make new products, we can design new art, make new music, but all of that has an impact on the culture. And I think we just need to be taking into account which way we're pushing our culture. The same way each parent, it's their responsibility to understand parenting styles while they're bearing the responsibility of forming a new human being as they age through development stages. It's our responsibility as an individual in a culture to recognize our power to shape that culture and what we do on a daily basis to do so. I know so many people go to work and then come home and are literally killing their downtime. I mean, Americans in general, as far as I can tell, are pretty bad with leisure time, but
they're in a vegetative state.
Exactly. Yeah. But at the same time, you can use that time period to try to make an impact on the culture and try to change it in the only way we can, which is the way that we think is best. And obviously,
that's what we're doing here, right?
It's what we're doing here right now, but it's also, that's a double-edged sword. People who think it needs to be changed in the wrong direction are they're more dangerous than people who are not trying to affect change.
Right. And, you know, going down this line even more, that's why podcasts are becoming so popular. That's why, you know, normal CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, they can't be trusted because you can see their agenda of how they're trying to propagate culture. And to me, it's insulting to my intelligence because it's so blatant and in your face. But that's why we have internet and the access to be able to share our culture in the way we want to see it, and we don't have to plug in to those sources. That's why young people don't have cable TV. They don't subscribe to that. And, you know, going on the other line of how important it is to think about how we affect our culture and in the future, we don't think long term in our policy a lot of the time. We think of right now. We think of within this 4 years, this 8 years of that person's ability to stay in power. And even within that, you know, the guys that are presidents, they're in their 70s, right? Like they come from completely different time periods. And also besides that, their background of knowledge is not adequate to think about these things. And we need to have groups of people that are high level thinkers from all areas to be able to make these decisions, right? And that's really upon us now, our culture, to say, hey, this is what we need, and we need to keep pushing that idea. And you know, there's a lot of things around it, but you know, I wouldn't be opposed to an age limit in governance. But
well, I think part of that problem can be seen not even just the age, but just the lack of future thinking.
Yeah.
In debate questions, in the questions the media asks, not only presidents and people who hold office, but people who are running for office, nobody is asked what they view of the world or what their view of the world will be in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. It's only about the immediate change that they're willing to make, that they're going to promise, that eventually they're going to butt heads with some opposing party member over and fail to create to begin with, let alone looking down the road farther. And so I think, as to what you're saying, there needs to be more emphasis on the big picture, on the big timeline. And people who are 70, no offense to 70-year-olds, they're not thinking 50 years down the road. Like,
totally.
They're,
right. And, you know, an example of this outside of politics where it's clear that it works is, you know, you look at Jeff Bezos and Amazon. Every single new project that they work on, they have a 10-year plan. They do not expect to be profitable in any new venture for 10 years. he has his company mapped out 300 years into the future.
What?
Yes, he thinks long term. That's how he does everything. And you wonder why he's the richest person in the world.
300 years.
300. His company, Blue Origin, they have I believe it's a 500-year roadmap that obviously is very just the general direction.
Yeah.
But within each of that, they have pillars that they hit. And he thinks long term. You look at Elon Musk and Tesla. He almost went bankrupt multiple times, put all of his own fortune on the line because he thought long term, and he knew all I have to do is I need to build these factories. I need to build up the resources to be able to mass produce things in the way I want. And then boom, they're now the most successful car company in the world. And that is from long-term thinking. So we need to put that into governance, which is why a non-politician is such a great idea for president. Unfortunately, there's some other problems.
He's scared of what you get when he asks for it, though.
Exactly.
The non-politician, just not him.
Exactly.
But we're going such cool directions and off the charts right now. But
yes.
Just getting back to the impact of culture on the individual and on society itself, I just wanted to touch on pastoralist cultures.
Yes.
So pastoralist cultures, they're spawning from people who live in areas that don't have the ecosystem to allow for farming or for agricultural wealth. So people were forced to herd. So they herded goats, sheep, cattle. They herded things that could be stolen.
Right.
But they were also subject to just chance, luck, and the harshness of the weather.
Totally.
And so in these pastoralist cultures, they were spawning grounds for warrior classes, for rustlers and raiders, for thieves, for fighters, for honor.
Right.
But more than that, for beyond authoritarian parenting and also the mistreatment of women, it spawned desert monotheism, which is this distinct hierarchy where there's one all-ruling, all-knowing God.
It's a simple life. It's a simple religion in a sense. It's black and white.
And they had to be able to justify the goods and the bads. So, you're a successful herder, and then the next day you get held up and maybe killed or maybe not killed. But either way, you have to be able to justify mentally.
Or wolves come and eat half your
why
flock.
Suddenly you lost all of your wealth. And so they developed this God, this Christian God, Judaistic God. Christian God obviously got intermingled with all the Greek ideas. But so this Judaistic God that has since been exported all across the world.
Right.
And so we have this leftover cultural artifact from a pastoralistic culture that is dictating the social norms in the West. So in the West, people are...
And real quick, though.
Go ahead.
I have to say, isn't all civilization built off of a pastoralistic... God, I can't speak. Pastoralistic culture
you had it
in
right,
a sense.
Pastoralistic.
Because before that, it was just hunter-gatherers. And then this is in the sense where we started, raising things for a living. We started organizing. We started kind of, even though it is individualistic, it still is kind of the breakaway from the whole hunter-gatherer type of society.
So you're confusing pastoralists with just agriculturalists. So because there are societies that had herds and they domesticated farm animals essentially, but they also had shares of crops that made them stagnant. So they were stuck into one location. Herders, on the other hand, were able to move around.
Right.
They had all of their wealth in a movable thing, a movable herd,
Totally.
if you will. And so, the East was not a pastoralistic culture at all. They didn't have, they were anchored down. They had their village and that's where they stayed. Even in Europe, in Christianity, when Christianity was developed by intermingling Judaism with the virtues of Greek philosophers, that was still not necessarily strictly a pastoralistic culture, right? It had other things as well. But I'm saying that it was this desert mentality, this you have to watch out for yourself, you have to go achieve on your own, you are responsible between you and God, you know, and that is kind of dictated this individualistic society that we now live in.
Totally.
That is very different and juxtaposed to the collectivist norm of wanting to be part of your society, of being stationary, of accepting what comes your way and not needing to ask for forgiveness or
I bet they had a high R7 variant percentage for the
pastoralists. Yeah, for sure.
Yes.
Yeah. But what I'm getting at is, you know, there are these memes, there are these ideas, these seeds that sprout and become defining factors, defining aspects of cultures. And I think if we can look from an objective view at where parts of our culture comes from, we can become more aware of our own cultural biases.
Right.
And with that, make decisions from not necessarily an objective standpoint, but from a more objective standpoint,
right,
about what we want to value. Because we're
at least not an ignorant standpoint where you're not aware of that bias.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
Totally.
I mean, because to me, there are so many problems that all come down to people being ignorant of their biases. And it's not something that's like, well, shame on them and they're fucking idiots. No, it's like, well, they're victims of their own biases. I'm victim of my own biases. It's just that mine aren't as detrimental, you know? And it's I'm fortunate enough to have grown up in an area that is far and away some of the, like part of the most, like one of the most open cultures that I've come across in Santa Cruz, California. There's a lot of weirdos and we're proud of it, you know? And
totally.
And so it's like unique ideas and unique perspectives are cherished and celebrated. And with that, you know, there's a lot of fluidity and thought process. People are willing to hear other people's ideas and perspective. And even still, even with that, we're, crippled by the political system that we have. And I still think crippled by this pastoralistic religious notion. I mean,
so how do we break away from that? Right?
It's easy to point out the problems. It's way harder to point the solutions, you know?
Right. You know, maybe it's identifying the new need, right? Because that whole culture formed out of the need in their way to survive, right? All those came out of their unique needs. And now we have a new set of needs, and maybe we need to clearly define them and agree upon them, right?
Well, I absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. We need a new set of needs, and those needs need to dictate the culture. But in abandoning the need for personal meaning, for
no.
Because people, in order to deny religiosity, in order to deny religion, the religion of Christianity, which is still foundational to America, people would need to let go of the kind of sleeping pill they've been taking to nullify the nightmare of what happens when I die, of what gives my life meaning, because we're no longer defined by our jobs. At least for the most part, people are completely alienated from their jobs. They go to work, get paid, come home. That's not the life I want to live, but that's a life that most people end up living. So people aren't defined by their jobs. They don't have a sense of purpose. It's a lot of filling time and killing time. Yes. And so people find purpose, reason, and essentially self-definition in their religion. And that religion is
well, maybe we need to create a new religion of life, religion of prosperity in a sense, and that's why I think the universal basic income can be great, because
we're jumping to universal basic income.
Well, in a sense, let me get there, because what this does is, you said people work a monotonous 9 to 5 that they don't care about. They don't take intrinsic value from their work. But now that we create a baseline for them, they can now focus their energy and their work towards something that they want. But that's why, and you can't just say, oh, here's a bunch of money and everyone's just going to act that way. It has to be guided. There has to be a path and an agreed upon movement to that direction, And so,
well, and that's the hardest part, right? Because you can't tell people, oh, now you need to find your purpose and your passion,
Right.
but it needs to be built into the culture, because what I see happening, universal income kicks out, and just a huge spike in video games, a huge spike. Suddenly there'd be more demand for augmented reality, for VR games. And that's how people would spend most of their time, because most people haven't spent enough time exploring, and it's work to explore passions and purpose. It's hard work. Like, I even like to say I enjoy writing, but I can go for months without writing because that blank page is such a daunting fiasco of a task.
I think an example of what I'm saying, or a way that you can go about this, right, is, okay, if we now give out universal basic income, the idea of going to school, going to college to get qualified, to get a job, to provide yourself, the whole meaning goes away, or at least it changes. So if we are going to now change the structure of how people live and provide for themselves, we also need to change how we teach people. What are the values at a young age? What should you be focusing on? And that's why when we say, oh, culture, then, culture co-evolves with the evolution. And right now we need to change our culture in a way where we change our value system. So then that way, over time, that value system then allows different, like, for example, with collectivistic cultures, they have low R7 variant. Well, if we change the values of what everyone really wants at a young age, over time, we can change our genetic variants on different things to have different outcomes, goals, needs, and all that. And I'm missing on some important verbiage here, but I hope you guys get my gist with what I'm saying, where you can't just plug in a mechanism, or you plug in a money and expect the change to occur without implementing a proper mechanism to do it.
You can't inject cash and expect organic change to be beneficial at all.
Exactly.
Where the culture has just come from go to work, do your work, come home, watch TV. That was like the culture of the 20th century, the late 20th century. It's, look at Everybody Loves Raymond as a prime example of like, oh, you go do your work, you come home, watch TV. That was the whole show. The whole show was them wanting to watch TV.
Right. And another thing to think about when we're talking about this is money the right approach? Because just like how we talked about in the Philippines, they are much poorer than the United States, but they have way higher percentages of happiness, right? And so maybe money isn't the mechanism to increase everyone's welfare. I don't know, but that's why we need to have really, really smart people from different cultures, different ages, different backgrounds, working on these problems in positions that actually can affect change, and that's where I think we're holding up right now.
So you talk about money and you say you don't know if that's the right call. And I think you're absolutely right in that doubt, because as the way we have it, our country has a huge economic capital, but a distinct and horrible difference between classes, right? Where it's very stratified culture.
Totally.
We have very low social capital. So people do not trust the people around them for the most part.
Exactly.
And with that, people are less likely to join any type of public organization, because they don't necessarily trust in the people around them. And
reciprocity is low valued.
Yes. And I think just injecting a little bit of money wouldn't solve that. I think, I don't know how, but obviously changing the culture would be the way to go. The issue is that there's this entire generation of people that would essentially need to be the forgotten people. It'd be like, oh, Generation X, generation ? Forgotten generation, because it would be abandoning the people who grew up in this culture that is now, from my eye, obsolete.
Totally.
And so the question becomes, like you said, what do we do?
Yeah. Here, I got a perfect example from the book about this, right? So
shoot it.
He shows an example of being on a plane and the difference between being in first class versus coach or passenger. So I'm gonna read what he says here. If the plane has a first class section, there's almost a fourfold increase in the odds of a coach passenger having air rage. Fourfold, 4 times.
4 times the air rage.
That's insane. Force coach passengers to walk through first class when boarding, and you more than double the chances further. So they get to walk by all the people that are above them, right? That's what's in their head. Nothing like starting a flight by being remembered of where you fit in the class hierarchy, and completing the parallel with violent crime when air rage is boosted in coach by reminders of inequality. The result is not a crazed coach passenger sprinting into first class to shout Marxist slogans. It's the guy being awful to the old woman sitting next to him or the flight attendant. And so it's even worse because their rage of not being in the first class doesn't get shouted back out the first class people. It gets shouted back at their peers, and it pits the lower class against themselves. And I think that's exploited everywhere. And so a perfect example of this fixing, of this whole system being fixed, is Southwest. In the 80s, Southwest, I think they had like five 747 Boeing planes. They ended up having, they were going to have to sell one to be able to make it through that next year. But instead, what they decided to do, they took away all first class. They made every seat the exact same value. And they said, hey, what we're doing here is we're focusing on an equal experience, an experience where it doesn't matter how much money you have, doesn't matter about anything. We come here to give you a quality experience and get you to where you need to go, right? Now that company is one of the most successful, I think they might be the most successful airline in the United States right now. And all that they did was take away first class and make everyone's seat the same, where it was first come, first serve in that sense. And that was a culture fix. They fixed a few mechanisms that then more aligned with the culture that they wanted, propagated over enough time, and now they're an extremely successful airline that people swear by and only fly Southwest, and I think that's just a great example of how we can look at issues that are clear, that we can study and test, and then make small mechanism changes to actually fix the problem, right?
Well, it's taking a very socialistic stance on the changes to be made. And I super agree, especially, if you look at stratified culture and the amount that the rich make, and then the amount that the rich pay into taxes, the discrepancy is huge.
Right.
And if we look also at stratified cultures, the bigger the difference between the poor and the rich, the less the rich are paying into public goods.
Right.
So the more policies start shifting towards helping the rich save their money, and spend money on private goods.
Right.
Whereas the best thing to help the greater amount of people is to shift money into public goods like public education, universal health care, public transportation.
But I totally agree with you. But the coolest part about this is they're one airline out of many.
Yeah.
It's not a universal shift within the whole airline community, right? Or all the other companies. And now, because they chose to change this culture shift, the other ones were still existing, but they were able to succeed higher. And so I don't want us to say, oh, we're going to put all of our money into public education controlled by the government, right? The federal government. No, each subculture needs to have control over that.
It needs proposing to be like a city. Like a city is saying oh, in this city, we're going to have all the houses look, I think have relatively similar rent, and each person in the city is going to be, available for our universal care system.
I think each subculture needs to have enough say to make real influences on their own subculture, not dictated by some overarching culture that tells them, no, this is how you do it. Because that's clearly we see it everywhere today, where we have one big group telling another smaller group how they need to act and what they need to do, and it's just not going to work that way.
So you're
so it's
more libertarian in this stance, and that get rid of the
capitalistic structure modified by some sort of control into how much exploit you can.
But you're talking about local control strictly.
Right. Yes, and yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say how that works on a scale when you're talking about billions of people, but I think the more control you give small groups of people to actually influence what's happening in their lives, the more attached they are to the things happening in their lives, the more care that they have, and the more they feel like they have actual agency to do something meaningful in their life.
We're talking about increasing social capital.
Yeah.
So increasing people's trust in social good, and that their ability to impact it is high.
Totally. Yeah. And I mean, my dad just told me that this guy, Miles Wolff, who's multi-millionaires, ran a lot of big businesses, and he chooses, you know what he told my dad? He said he likes to sit in the very back row because you can't recline next to the 300-pound people, like the biggest people on the plane. Please put them next to me, one on the aisle, one on the window. Let me sit in the middle, because he wants to teach himself. He doesn't want to put himself above anyone else, right? And what the whole point is that people seek out these type of experiences when they have the agency to do it on their own, not like mandated. Say, oh, even though you have X amount of money, you can't buy a first class ticket. But guess what? You take that away and say, no, they're all the same. And I guarantee you're going to have more people willingly put themselves in positions to experience a less than culture, in a sense. Like I think there's a lot of want to relate to other people. It's just giving them the chance to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, to experience being in the in-group.
Yes.
Essentially. So like everybody's included is non-exclusive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a tricky thing. All right. What else you got?
I don't have much time.
Okay. One other thing that I wanted to get to. So there is basically a statistic saying that it's not the exact statistic, but the higher density of people living in an area, the higher deviant behavior and social pathology, which this is a thing that we're always going to have, right? Because our places keep on getting more dense. We keep on getting more people, global warming, sea levels rising, less space to be on. And so with that, there's all these, what's going to happen is it's not going to make people more aggressive or make people more timid. It's going to exacerbate the people who are already aggressive and already timid. And so in a world that we're growing in density, we need to make sure that the environments that they start out at are good enough, so that way they don't create these, hyper aggressive people because they were in a stressful environment as a young kid and they have a bigger amygdala, right? And we need to, that's where we need to focus on. And it's not so much of everyone needs the same thing. We need a baseline starting point that allows everyone a reasonable environment to then grow. And that needs to be the focus of this ever increasing dense world.
So yeah, what you're saying is that as populations grow more dense, the extremes grow more dense as well. So there's less people in the middle. The people who are prone to aggression would be more aggressive. People who are prone to timidity would be more timid. And with that, people who are prone to any type of instability mentally are going to be more unstable. Exactly. And so the impetus and emphasis, it needs to be in educating people as they grow about potential, their internal makeup is what I'm gathering from this, that having awareness and not saying everybody needs to have the same level of awareness or the same type of awareness, but that people need to be aware of themselves and their own tendencies.
Yeah.
And
an example, if you had a city that had ghettos and then the city grew 20% in population without altering the ghettos would become more violent, right? And there would be more death. And so we are always increasing in density. And because of that, we need to handle these areas that have poor environments, and we need to essentially get rid of the ghettos, which I know is a lifelong problem.
Yeah, well,
but
I mean, and the trouble is that states with the highest inequality spend the least amount of money on education.
Exactly.
And education is the primary crime-fighting tool. It's literally the thing where if you inject education into a culture, the crime significantly diminishes, like 100% of the time. So it's something where it's the educational front that we need to be engaging in. And it's not necessarily education of like, oh, the history of Columbus, but the education of just
social intelligence.
Exactly. Social intelligence, the knowledge that you can in fact better yourself, the knowledge that you can pursue learning and you have the potential to achieve and to become a functioning member and contributor to your community.
Right.
And all of this is all seated on top of mental and emotional stability. And I think there's not enough, I mean, this is just my own opinion, there's not enough emotional and mental stability taught in schools. I don't know about you, but I was never educated about how to handle my emotions, about what certain feelings do to me, and about how I can take a different approach to certain points in my life where, you know, like I'm feeling aggressive. Or
imagine in the first grade, if you had an hour a day where you go into breakout groups of 5 people and you have a counselor there and you do a group counseling session in school. And now that second grader who, you know, has an alcoholic dad and an absent mom, or the other way around, and has all these other problems, they can speak that out loud with someone who's actually listening. And then all those people, little kids around them, are hearing that and like, whoa, I have never thought of that world, or I've never seen it like that, right? And then like it creates a higher emotional intelligence. I'm not saying that's what we need to do, but I'm saying we need to start actually like working on those areas. We need to create a social intelligence curriculum.
I think beyond all of this, it's looking at all of the institutions designed to help people and realize that they are all treatment institutions and not prevention institutions. And so if we, instead of treating psychological and emotional health like something to be treated as symptoms arise, but something to be prevented from going into a negative state. So everyone would see the counselor and everyone would be taught about how to regulate emotional and psychic states.
It's taking the painkillers for your back pain rather than doing yoga.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, totally.
But it's something that can be easily actually injected into the culture by making it part of the school system, the educational system.
It's a cultural norm.
Exactly. And so this is where, I mean, part of my desire to go back to school and my desire to study PhD, to get a PhD in some sort of developmental consciousness studies, is with the hopes and the naive dreams of being able to have some sort of significant impact on the education system, on teaching children about their mental states and about the regulation of those mental states. And it's something that I know people have tried to do for a long time and have all failed. I'd be happy to fail too, but I'd even be happier to succeed. I think it's something that is at the bottom of making beneficial cultural change.
Yep. And folks, that is how we affect our generation for the good.
Boom.
That's wrap.
Yeah, that's perfect timing, 4:18. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. I know this is not going out necessarily, but I feel like we touched on a lot of cool shit in this talk. Yeah, this was a lot of fun. It's less than an hour, so it's actually something that we could probably just pump out. I feel like there's mostly good things in that talk.
Totally, and you know the fumbles it's okay. That's how we learn, right?
Yeah. Funnily enough, so we wanted to do a podcast on this entire book, Behave. This whole entire talk was based on one chapter.
And the first talk we did an hour and 45 minutes, I think, on like 10 pages.
Yeah. This book is insanely deep. I highly recommend the read Behave by Robert Sapolsky. It is a landmark for integrating different buckets of information and different disciplines. And it's essentially a lighthouse I think most scholars should be aiming for in looking at the cross-pollination of intellectual areas.
When thinking about why things happen, we really look at the mechanisms of why things happen here. And when you understand the mechanism, all the resulting information can make sense, right?
But quick caveat, I think where he's going is going to be against free will, just so you know. I think Robert Sapolsky is getting to the place where everything can be attributed to a biological finding. So like a tumor in the brain or the way someone was raised as a kid, and it's going to be stripping the responsibilities that we like to give to people, the responsibility that is enough to punish them. And instead it's going to be saying this person needs treatment or this person needs help, not this person needs punishment. So I just want to
prep me.
Yeah. That's where I think it's going. I don't think it's going to say strip people of all responsibility, but
well, I have nothing bad to say about the book so far. So I'm ready to have my mind state shifted.
Let's go.
Let's do it.
All right. Till next time. Hopefully this has been simply stated enough.
Yeah.